thanks to Aneta, many thanks to Pavel, many thanks to all the members of the project, because yesterday I was really lucky I could attend the meeting. So what I did yesterday, I just wrapped up also some of your findings, and I will start a bit on the starting question of my current research at the moment, where I'm starting from the findings from my book. And then living in the UK, I could not think about Brexit and the debates that have been going on since February 2006 in the UK. And yesterday, in some of the debates I've attended, in a way, everyone has found that issues might be quite similar, but they take the colors of the domestic politics of these countries. So it's important that we understand the sources of Euroscepticism, but we understand also the themes that Euroscepticism can take at the domestic level in order then to answer or advise on how we can change communication around Europe. My research stems from my interest looking at the accession of the 2004, so I was looking particularly at this region and how attitudes were changing. My main research interest is on public attitudes, not so much on party-based Euroscepticism, where the literature has mainly focused looking at around the debates of parties and attitudes of parties. More recently, there is an emerging interest also in looking at how civil society organizes, and a colleague of mine at the time of my PhD research, John Fitzgibbon, talks about Euro-alternativism. And in a way, you touched a bit upon this concept yesterday, because you were telling about these events you have organized. And more or less, you said there is a general positive attitudes, but also when you have positive attitudes, there are critical voices. So despite you may be supportive of the European Union and the institutions as they are, you are more critical towards the direction of the policies or the way that the European Union is today. So there seems to be some critical voices also in these positive attitudes, and what Fitzgibbon talks about, he talks about Euro-alternativism, a pro-systemic opposition to the European Union as it is. In the book that Aneta was referring about, we were trying to start from this research, and we're trying also to address some of the possible avenues for further research, in particular looking at those actors and those issues that may affect Eurosceptic debates and narratives at the domestic level. And in particular, by being in the UK and looking at the debates in the UK, I found that emotions, and you talked about emotions yesterday as well, seem to emerge and become more relevant. In particular, for instance, in the Latvian case, Iveta was talking about how, for instance, negative attitudes seem to take a more emotional dimension. So before starting on my research, I summed up some of your findings yesterday, what you found as a common frame and common themes that you have found that seem to be already addressing the literature and some of the research that we have done and some of the research that you can find also in the book. For instance, Galpin and Trent talk about the lack of a positive narrative. When we talk about the European Union, there is general a negative debate or a lack of positive narrative. You talk about this emotional dimension, and generally the emotional dimension in the Austrian case, the colleagues were talking about, in two cases, they were talking about love for the European Union. But generally it's a sort of hate attitude towards the European Union, or a very critical attitude. You were talking about possible cleavages, as in the German case, and you were talking about a sort of cleavage between a more cosmopolitan liberal attitude and a more conservative attitude. More recently, some colleagues have published a book where they talk about the rise of the well-educated. And David Runciman, recently from the University of Cambridge, also talk about how these seem to affect domestic elections. It has happened in Britain, but we can find it also with the American case. To me, it's interesting because I found it also in my own research, a mismatch between the expectations that, in particular, Central and Eastern European countries had before joining the European Union and the deliveries after joining the European Union. And something that Bulgaria has found, that I have found also in the Greek case, this idea that we blame the EU also when domestic leaders sometimes take difficult choices, and therefore it's easy to blame the EU because citizens don't know. And this, in a way, can this affect further the negative attitudes that is already persistent in the social debates. There is also a persistent double view across countries, so you can map a sort of areas and regions across the European Union. You have countries like Latvia who say that we are very diligent in implementing regulations, and then we need to wait for the catch-up of other countries that are less diligent, or the case of Austria or Germany, blaming the others, blaming Central and Eastern Europe. But the same with Slovakia, saying we have already paid the cost of the transformation, and now we need to wait for Greece, in this particular case, creating a sort of binary relationship with the other that, in a way, underlines a sort of populist argument as well. Also, there are other common narratives that exist between Bulgaria and Greece, where you can just blame ourselves for what is happening, this lack of fairness or this need to catch up all the times that exist in Bulgaria, but it has been found also in the research on Greece in particular. And one of the findings that, for instance, I had already in my research was that it's difficult to understand the European Union because remote governance is really difficult also to be communicated. So some of the things that to communicate Europe following on these findings, and some of the things that, for instance, research on communicating Europe has already found. Gosh, I didn't want to. Sorry what I'm doing. Oh, did to close? It's about going local. If people don't understand remote governance, just talk about local politics and try to link those salient issues that are salient at the domestic level by linking them to European issues. So, for instance, in the case of Austria, you were talking about roaming, you were talking about the position of lobbies and how they can affect also people's health. This is important for people at times. So try to link Europe with national issues that are relevant at the time. In my case, in my research, I found that a type of capillary information, and in this case it was in the Hungarian case, where public actors that people trust more, sometimes more than politicians, can probably help to support and sustain this narrative. And you talk about interactive games with very young people. And you already said yesterday, some of the colleagues said, let's avoid the project fear strategies. And I would agree with that. Think about the UK case and the Remain narrative, for instance. But something that you have found, and that I had found in my research 3 years ago with a colleague, was that European identity develops by experiencing Europe more than feeling European. So I'm giving you just numbers, a few numbers to wake up maybe, but just for a second, then I'll pass to figures and bar charts that are far better, and I skip on these. What we have found, this is a study I did with Fabio Serricchio, a colleague in Italy, and he generally works on Italy, I generally work on Poland. And we decided by using both Eurobarometer data and Intune data that were collected at the University of Siena to look at attitudes towards the European Union. And looking at the recent years, the last more or less 10 years, we can find that levels of support have increasingly dropped. But across all the countries, Poland is the one that remains the most enthusiastic of the EU experience. In the case of Poland, actually, I found that before joining the European Union, they didn't have high expectations. So probably having very low expectations of what EU membership is before helps maintaining very high levels of support afterwards. What we did afterwards was looking at what was changing across both East and West member states and looking at difference across Italy and Poland and the two regions. And what we found that the only significant variable on support for the European Union was practicing the EU, experiencing the EU. And we measured all the different frameworks of analysis, so looking at economic support, evaluations of the economic situation, identity, European national identity, looking at the domestic politics and looking at political parties. We look at cognitive mobilization, the framework provided by Ronald Inglehart in the 70s, where he says that the higher the level of education, the more you would understand the European Union, and therefore the more likely you would support the European Union. Overall, the only variable is EU identity is achieved. That is significant all across our cases, both West member states, East member states, Poland and Italy. So overall, in words, that is much easier, we found that across the East region, generally, a ratio between costs and benefits and the positive evaluation of the economy, perceiving that you benefited from EU membership, was a significant factor in determining support for the European Union. Generally, in the case of Western member states, the political dimension was the most significant. But overall, as I said, it was experiencing Europe. And by experiencing Europe, we constructed this variable by bringing together, respecting the European Union laws and institutions, by talking more than one language of the European Union, and also exercising your European citizens' rights. So voting, for instance, for the European Parliament in another country, living in another country, or voting at local elections in another country. And this would enhance more levels of support. So this was some of the findings that I think fit with your own research. My research instead at the moment, as I said, was interested in looking at the emotions and looking at the actors and the voices of Euroscepticism. And what I did, I worked with a colleague who uses a completely different approach. And the colleague is from Greece, and Greece had a referendum before Britain in July 2015. And we look at the domestic debates by looking at blogs before the referendum. And we were trying to look at what type of emotions could emerge within the narrative of citizens and the way they were engaging with the referendum. And we were interested in looking at the emotions because we think that there is a distance between actual facts and perceptions of citizens. And between the perceptions that citizens have and the actual facts, citizens feel engaged by a mediation of the emotions that can take them. And these emotions then they may affect their own choices on how they may vote, for instance, for the referendum. By looking at the case of Britain, I look at the Leave campaign and look at the blogs and the way the citizens were talking about the European Union. And by looking at some of their comments that you find on the right of my slides, I find that there are four main logics around the debates. One looks at the European Union as a dictatorship that is a bit what came up also in the case of Latvia. We diligently answer what comes from the European Union and what generally is perceived by small member states where there is a sort of asymmetrical relationship. There is this populist idea that has come up also between Bulgaria, Greece, or Slovakia and Greece, that there is us and versus them. In this case was both political elites and the European Union. This idea that we blame the EU, but we blame everyone. Also, there was this idea that was typical of Britain, that when we joined, it was a mistake. So there is a legacy of history. In one of the letters I have found in another research, someone was saying, my mom campaigned in the 70s against the European Union. Now my mom passed away. I'm providing funds to the Leave campaign, respecting the memory of my mom and respecting my country. There is increasing also disillusionment with the political elites. In some of the comments, they were saying they've been schooled in the same colleges, or they've all attended the same schools. It's completely different from our life. They are completely different from us. And in particular, they were comparing political leaders to past political leaders. A comment, for instance, at the reference of Churchill was bless. And if Britain needs to choose, must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea. So the only choice for Britain at the time was choosing to leave the European Union. And it was charged with a very strong emotional dimension. And when someone was trying to intervene from the Remain campaign, the answer and the replies were multiplying with this sort of urgent demand that it was important to leave. It's our moment. We are celebrating the Queen. It was the month when the Queen was celebrating her birthday. Let's make it and the sun will shine. So what I did afterwards, I looked at the referendum and the emotions across public opinion. And this was a small research fund with colleagues at the University of Surrey. And we surveyed 2 weeks after the referendum, 2,000 citizens through YouGov. And we look at what type of emotions people felt after the referendum. And we gave them 22 different emotions, positive and negative. But the most cited emotions were generally negative. The most positive were coming from UKIP voters, who generally felt excited or happy towards the future. But if we look at the age group, the highest percentage feels very, very uncertain. And this is the type of feeling that generally Remain voters still have in the UK. If we look at the different voters, as I said, the UKIP voter feel hopeful and happy and excited towards the future. They also felt very proud, as I will show afterwards. While instead, Lib Dem voters are the ones that feel mostly uncertain and disappointed, similarly to the Labour voter. If I look at socioeconomic groups, the richest socioeconomic groups are the ones that feel more uncertain or feel more anxious or apprehensive towards the future, while the lowest socioeconomic groups are the ones that instead feel more hopeful and feel more content or feel at the same time also a bit anxious and apprehensive towards the future. The variable that mostly look at was the ones that are still studying or how education may change attitudes. And we actually found that people who didn't complete their studies and completed their studies when they were 15 or younger are the ones who feel more hopeful towards the future by leaving the European Union, while instead graduate students, university students, are the ones who feel more uncertain. So in a way, the referendum divided the country a sort in two groups, where one group feels more hopeful and happy towards the future, and one that feels more uncertain, anxious, and apprehensive towards the future. After doing this, I wanted to look at what voices and what actors were within this narrative. And I look at 3 newspapers. In this case, it's just one newspaper. They were comprehensive of different views, positive, negative, and a sort of trade-off behind the campaign. Looking just at one of them, most of the voices that I have found, both as political actors that are cited, journalists, or letters from readers, it's male voices. So 85% of the news, and here I have about 313 items, were representing males' voices. When I look at the news and the themes, most were about taking back control, this idea that we need to protect Britain from the inflow of immigrants. For instance, before the campaign, just the week before the campaign, there were debates on the fact that every night between 8 and 12 Albanians were smuggled from the coast of France to the UK. Think about the number of Albanians joining illegally the country within a year, or creating news where they were talking about the increasing number of burglars in some areas, in the same areas, the increasing number of Bulgarian or Romanian immigrants, and linking together some particular communities and particular events. So what I have found with the research, both with Evans and looking at the blog of the Leave Vote, and I close on my presentation, is that it seems that everyone is to blame. There is a sense of disengagement with politics, critical voices towards both the domestic situation and the European Union. The most dominant emotion that I have found are anger, fear, uncertainty, distrust, but then I find also hope and excitement and a sort of polarization of different emotions. Also, and in particular, more in the Greek blogs than in the British blogs, the type of voices are quite informal. The way they address sometimes also directly politicians is in a very informal type of narrative. And in the case of Britain, it seems to be the main voice for the independence of the country. And leavers generally, I feel very excited. There has been a sort of negative narrative further that added up in the case of Bob Geldof. When he took the Thames a few days before the referendum, he said, "You are like politicians. You lived your life on the benefits you had after the Live Aid in the 80s, and now you want to tell us how we should behave. Just go back. The country is full of unemployment. People are suffering and are poor. You don't know what is life in the UK today." So I think that in this research, what is important is the emotional dimension that you have also found. Why does Euroscepticism create or triggers this type of emotions? Can we try to trigger the same emotions for a positive view of the European Union? Pulse for Europe, for instance, recently has tried to do that, but mostly I think in Germany, not so much in other countries. And these emotions, in a way, it's something that Ernesto Laclau, but also Margaret Canavan talk about. It provokes also an emotional dimension that strengthens people's attitudes and brings these people together. It creates this bonding that we belong to this feeling and we belong together. We are stronger than politicians. We are stronger than everything and we can do it together. And these people are the ones that really feel behind. So you saw that the lowest socioeconomic groups are the ones who feel more hopeful. These are the people that the European Union needs to communicate to. These are the ones that really feel behind. And Galpin and Trans say, and now they're looking at whether there are pockets of negativity also online, and how social media engage with the EU. Issues about the European Union seem also from your research trapped in this negative narrative. So can we try then to create a positive narrative? And as I said, I would avoid a project fear type of narrative. But for instance, some of you, I think it was the Austrian case, by talking through images or names or retrieving, of supporting a type of familiarization with the European Union, possibly linking the European Union to national politics and those issues that are important, can help and support a communication and improve the communication between citizens and the European Union. Thank you.